Hello and welcome to In Search of Black Power. Today, I'll be one of your co-hosts, Dr. Rasheem, independent social scientist and scholar, and I'm joined by
Mary Jalil for long, MJ for short, policy advocate with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
Burn, 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 burn. Today, what we're going to be talking about is basically we're going to focus on Black women below the poverty threshold and activism in defense of home. And it's a specific focus on Baltimore yesterday and tomorrow. And we have some reference material that we'll be using.
So we'll be referencing primarily Rhonda Y. Williams' article, We're Tired of Being Treated Like Dogs, Poor Women and Power Politics in Black Baltimore, which was released in 2001. And we'll also be referencing a great conversation that I was able to have with long-term OG, if you will, of ours, one of our elders, Miss Denise Jones-Dorsey, who is currently the board chair of the Northeast Housing Initiative and was formerly actually interim deputy director of public housing in Baltimore, and lived in public housing herself before she was the deputy director. So we have some great reference material for today. So
I love Miss Denise. Some of the main themes that we'll be covering in today's conversation are housing activism as a form of defense of home and self,
the role of Black women in welfare rights organizing in Baltimore.
We'll also be covering tension between Black capitalism and Black radical politics,
and political consciousness and the grassroots leadership amongst more communities.
And lastly, but definitely not least, we're going to look at lessons for contemporary housing and labor justice movements in Baltimore. And we'll be able to share a few of the folks who are contemporarily, if you will, working on some of these issues right here in this city. To frame it, one of the things that I feel like is important to start with as we look at this article is that in 1967, the state began targeting welfare recipients for fraud. And I mean, so much targeting that they prosecuted about 20 cases a week. So from 1969 to 1977, tenants had been complaining consistently about poor conditions in the housing complex. So that's just a little bit of the background. MJ, you could start us off with a few of the historical context to give some framing.
Yeah, so in the mid-60s, in the inner city, in inner cities in the North, the federal government really decided to target civil rights activists as well as Black power organizations. And in around 1967, Baltimore was among 11 other industrial cities that the president decided to target, will be the target of violence in 1967.
One interesting thing that happened during that time is that in 1966, CORE chose Baltimore as its target city and developed a program called Target City. And with that, they moved into an office on the 800 block of Gay Street. The focus and the reason for that, because they wanted to move into, and I'm using their words, move into the ghetto. And that's some of the framing. Also, I'll add in 1978, O'Donnell Heights public housing rent strike was the first ever rent strike in Baltimore City's history.
Right. It was really cool to hear about this because my family moves to Baltimore in 1964 and literally are in West Baltimore at this time. And after my grandparents passed away in the 70s, are literally public housing residents until this day. Like my aunts still live on public housing. So this really stuck out to me because I was just thinking about the stories that my mom had shared with me, just about living in the projects in the 70s. And the article rang true. So go ahead.
No, yeah. I mean, I feel like for me too, like, I feel like it's good when we could read something about contemporary, like a contemporary issue, like all of our contemporary issue have a historical source, right? So to be able to connect it with that, I definitely lived in public housing. as a young person. My mother was definitely a welfare recipient. There was a point early on when I wasn't Dr. Rasheem that I was a welfare recipient myself. So it's really good to like have this framing and be able to have a conversation around what does this look like in everyday living? What are some of the impacts, and what are some of the things historically that people did to navigate this space?
Right. Yeah. And before we get into some of the things that people were doing to navigate this space, some of the key locations that came up, and if you're familiar with Baltimore, these names will bring memories of your own to the forefront of your mind as you hear them. But Murphy Homes, which is literally where my peoples live, O'Donnell Heights, East Baltimore, Gay Street, like Rasheem mentioned a bit earlier, Pennsylvania Avenue, Fairfield, which in the 60s and 70s at the time was 99% Black, Gilmore Homes, which was also 99% Black, and Westport, which was also 99% Black. Fairfield, Gilmore, and Westport, those are all different projects, public housing projects that are all still open today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we also have another reference for Gilmore Homes and an act of protest that really started in Gilmore Homes in April of 2015. That was also the home of Freddie Gray, right? And where the whole Baltimore uprising really kicked off. So there's like a rich history of like, when we talk about place-based movements, like centered in the community and kind of from the ground up, like there's been a history of that in this city too.
Yes. So one of the things that we want to get into as we talk about the work that was happening at this time is the use of the Black radical tradition in Baltimore. So concepts like Black power, calling out elected officials, and grassroots base building were commonplace in Baltimore at this time, and to be honest, really still are commonplace. And I think it's a popular narrative and this thing that gets pushed back then and right now is that nothing is happening in the city. But in reality, there's actually so much happening in the city then, yesterday, and today. So much organizing is happening on the grassroots, and a lot of that having to do around base building and speaking truth to power, but also utilizing power to bring to fruition structural change. So at the time, there are a number of organizations that we'll talk about that are highlighted in this article, and the first one we'll talk about, and the one that's mentioned first, is UJoin. Rasheem, you want to tell us some about UJoin?
Yeah, UJoin, which means it's like U-join, but the longer name is Union for Jobs or Income Now. That was also located at 1061 North Gay Street. I feel like it's really important as folks are listening, and particularly if you live in Baltimore, to be able to mentally locate these places. On occasion, they work with CORE, as I mentioned before, in the mid 1960s. CORE designated Baltimore as its target city where it was going to do a lot of initiatives. In fact, CORE had a move to set up a location in Baltimore. The main interest and focus of Union for Jobs or Income Now was to mobilize poor and working class people. It was led by a young man by the name of Walter Lively at just the young age of 23. I'm not going to tell you what I was doing at the age of 23, but it wasn't leading movements that I could tell you. The main focus also of the organization was to address race, class, and state power. I feel like that's particularly important to mention when we highlight some of the differences and tensions between traditional integrationists and civil rights movement and how they contest for power in very distinct ways. They protested the exclusion of poor people from policymaking arenas. They also helped to establish the city's first welfare rights coalition, which was Mother Rescuers from Poverty. And we're going to talk about that a bit. Actually, let's just go ahead and move into talking about them now. They organized rent strikes against private landlords, and it was led by Margaret McCarty. She was a Black woman who's a mother of 7. She actually credits UJoin with opening up her political awareness.
Right. And in the article, U-Joint is credited, like class gets its street cred, and is noted as an org that gets under the establishment's skin, gets in their hair, and pulls hard. So
I love that analogy.
Right. And it's funny because in reading that, I was like, oh, that's how people feel about LBS. Like, I'm just 1 year on the team, and that is literally always what people have to say, that, you know, y'all say what need to be said, and y'all not scared to do it, and y'all not scared to call people out. And they love that about us, and it is clear that that is something that people here on the ground, everyday people, poor people, middle class people, working class people really appreciate in leadership and in organizers that are going to be honest and be direct about the things that they know they're facing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So speaking to Mother Rescuers from Poverty and Miss Margaret McCarthy, something that was really great that they were able to do was within Mother Rescuers from Poverty, within the first 3 months, they were able to have 75 active members and a mailing list of over 200 people. And in that short amount of time being able to do that work, they actually even frequently organized marches. And within 6 months, they had planned 6 protests that actually led to a meeting with the State Department of Public Welfare and Maryland legislators. So within the first 6 months of organizing as Mother Rescuers from Poverty, they were actually able to hold 6 protests. In February of 1964, 40 members marched from Baltimore to Annapolis demanding its items be a part of the settlement budget, actually. And all of this organizing work culminated in the Mother Rescuers from Poverty actually having a meeting with the State Department of Public Welfare officials and Maryland legislators.
What I want us to do with this information, so that folks, you just heard like quite a bit of information that MJ gave about Mother Rescuers of Poverty, right? They were led by Margaret McCarthy, which is a Black woman who was a mother of 7, who was not only a person who lived in the tenant housing, she was also a welfare recipient. So you start to see some of the like non-traditional Black radical leadership that is taking place. And we're going to take a deeper dive a little bit on that a little bit later. But also want us to look at the fact that, how we said in the first 3 months, how many active members, for example, were in U-Join. And then even within the first 6 months of Mothers Rescuers of Poverty, they had 6 protests. 6 months, 6 protests. And that led to a meeting with the State Department, public welfare officials, and Maryland legislator. I feel like it speaks to the ways in which people who don't feel like or see themselves as particularly political can have an impact on politics and have an impact on political engagement. So often I feel like because one of the things is like, because this show is called In Search of Black Power, and a lot of times when we hear things around power and as oppressed people, our relationship to power has been negative because of the way folks have actually used it. I want folks to be able to look at this as we're, in searching for Black power, that this was a mechanism and a means for Black power. And what Mothers Rescuers of Poverty and also U-Join did, again, having 75 active members and then having a mailing list of 200, which sounds like a small number, but it's actually great when you also think about they didn't have IG, there was not Facebook, there was not any of these things to like actually galvanize people. And then you think about also in their first 6 months having 6 protests, the level of mobilization that it takes to get people to be able to march and protest. But you also, you remember we were talking earlier about these different housing units that were like involved in this. We're talking about Murphy Homes, Gilmore Homes. We're talking about people on Gay Street. We're talking about Westport. We're talking about all of these different locations. If you think about the force, the potential, and the power that's connected, like when we get together as a unit with all of those groups, like if all of us showed up and decided that we were going to march or protest, like that's a powerful statement that they were able to actually do with the resources information that they had available. And I just think that's a remarkable thing when we're talking about In Search of Black Power. Like, how do we leverage that on a today type level?
Agreed. And if you know about Baltimore, you know that side to side, neighborhood to neighborhood, it is really siloed, if you will. But we see through the example of You Join and Mother Rescuers from Poverty that people connect across their differences or perceived differences, because we know Baltimore ain't nothing but a drop big, but those geographical differences do make a difference in our city. So seeing that they were able to and found the benefit in organizing across neighborhood, across community lines, across side lines, that is at play today. And I think kind of speaks to a thing that we don't, in Baltimore at least, often hear about, how people from across the city come together, galvanize, use their power to see structural change for the whole city. You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things when I was looking at different things, something that kept coming up was this target city, core making Baltimore a target city, and all of the things that came out of it. One of the things that's not talked about enough, and I plan on taking a deeper dive, and if you're a Baltimorean and you want to get deeper into some of the race work or the history that is Baltimore, Soul School.
Right.
Which was a grassroots Black educational institute. They rented a row house across from Murphy Homes. I feel like us identifying the place and the site of some of this movement is particularly important, because if you know all of these places, they come out of the projects or the hood, where people, like when you talk about building from the ground up, Soul School started with from the ground up and started in that particular area right across from Murphy Homes. But we have a lot of Baltimore housing and labor advocates that absolutely deserve mention. Some of the ones you're going to hear about, of course, and that you've already heard some about, is Margaret McCarty. Again, she led Mother Rescuers of Poverty, Mother of Seven. Walter Lively, who led You Join and helped Margaret McCarty start Mother's Rescuers of Poverty. You also have Miss Irene Lee. She was one of the first tenants to actually move into Lafayette housing in 1955. And you also have other folks like Reverend Annie Chambers of O'Donnell Heights and Bobby Cheeks of WRO.
Right. And something that's really cool about Annie Chambers and Bobby Cheeks of the Welfare Rights Organization. The Welfare Rights Organization is credited for being Baltimore's first welfare rights organizing group in the city as a whole, led by Bobby Cheeks. And Reverend Annie Chambers is still doing housing organizing today. Just a month ago, she led a press conference at Douglas Homes, where she currently lives, fighting against the oppressive water bill, BG&E bill hikes that are happening to residents currently right now. So this mother, Reverend, who's now Reverend Annie Chambers, who's mentioned in this article, is still doing this work currently right now. So this isn't isolated. This isn't just like a story of people who existed at one point in time and then faded into the history books, or faded into oblivion because people aren't talking about grassroots organizing work that's really happening on the ground level in Baltimore. She's a direct example of that, an elder that we have access to talk to now. And something that was cool that I found in my conversation with Miss Jones Dorsey, she actually referred to Miss Annie Chambers as the Fannie Lou Hamer of Baltimore, which, if you know about Fannie Lou, you know that is a great, amazing compliment. And it's great that we have one here, right? And I can speak to that. Her ability to speak truth to power hasn't faded at all, one bit.
I love that. Let's go ahead and get into talking about some of the women in Black radical tradition movement space, because I feel like that's really important to just basically like spend some time to talk about that and how some of the demographics of those women might be differently.
Yes. So as we get into that conversation, Rasheem, I'll ask you a question. And have you ever noticed like who actually gets the credit for introducing or welcoming Black women into organizing and into like leadership in movement space?
I feel like one of the things that I do notice is I feel like there's a different way in which we look at Black women's leadership. I feel like if we're looking at contemporary integrationists, we don't see a lot of necessarily Black women seen in leadership. They support, right? They are seen as like the folks who have the bake drives or have, like they're
have the fish
like
fry.
support, right?
Right.
They are, I don't want to say an accessory, but they seem to show up more, I guess you could say, like seen as like they are a support role, as opposed to in Black radical spaces, I see more examples and images of women in leadership positions.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think one, like, this person isn't mentioned in the article at all, but this is a really popular woman in movement history, Rosa Parks. You know, we see Rosa Parks as an accessory who is deemed with the responsibility of staying seated during the bus boycott, but in reality, she's the secretary of the National NAACP. She was doing organizing against lynching victims and Black women of sexual assault in the 40s at a time, but we never learned that part of Black women leading, and
Right.
even our biggest leaders, like everybody, Rosa Parks is an American household name, but
Right.
actually knowing the contributions that she made to women's rights, Black rights, and human rights in the country, the historiography of that is she sat down. And even the narrative that we get around how she was chosen over a Claudette Colvins, right, who is not a pristine, clean image for a movement like the Montgomery bus boycott movement. But how even that story that speaks to how what would I call it? Elitism is more important than the struggle and lived experience that people actually have. Like, that's the popular narrative in history around movement space. But when we actually look at history and how it played out, we know that people like Annie Chambers, people like Margaret McCarthy, who the way that we learn the history in typical school would tell us that those people didn't have leadership roles and weren't lifted up for the great contributions that they made in real time. That wasn't actually the case. They were leaders, they were presidents, they were making the decisions and pushing forward the work that really saw to fruition, structural change in Baltimore City.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that you highlight when we're talking about the difference between Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks is just one of the difference between the integrationist civil rights leaning and Black radical tradition, right? So the demographic there, they're more affluent, they're higher educated, they tend to be 30 plus. Right. And a lot of times very early on, they were fair-skinned. Right. Largely, there's something called, if folks want to Google it, the Blue Vein Society, where it's basically a group of Black people who really discriminate against other Black people who were darker skinned. It's from things like the Blue Vein Society that you also get things like the paper bag test, right? I also think it's a really great point that you highlight in talking about the fact that Rosa Parks is only seen for that small bit of her sitting on the bus and not giving up her seat, but kind of ignore all of this lifelong work that she has been doing as an organizer. Like, she's highlighted as the secretary of the NAACP in this one small incident where she's kind of like a supplement to the overall conversation, but not seen in the way of like her being specifically an organizer. And if we're looking at, for example, you mentioned Annie Chambers. She's a daughter of a minister and a former Catholic nun. Her mother was actually the governess of her widower father and his children. And also the fact that Reverend Annie Chambers became a mother at 12.
Right.
She got married at 14. Like that's not the traditional integrationist civil rights leader that we necessarily tend to think of. And I think that the fact that we don't know some of these stories are kind of purposeful. And I think some of it has to do with what is more appealing, or what is more considered acceptable, or we're doing the whole respectability politics dance, right? So some of these folks are not only lost to history um, because of direct erasure, but they were also excluded in a lot of the mainstream conversations about our movement history, in some cases even by Black people themselves. You know what I mean? When you have people like Reverend Chambers, who not only, again, like I said, was a mother at 12, married by 14, but that she's also 19 of 22 children herself.
Right.
You know what I mean? These are regular, and I feel like why this is important is because these are regular everyday people. Right. And when we talk about like the civil rights movement or Black movement, we are looking at, not that none of these other ones that I'm about to mention are bad people. We're looking at Adam Clayton Powell, and we're looking at Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're looking at Rosa Parks. We're looking at these pristine, polished images that are super professionalized, super accepted by white establishment, a lot more acceptable to white establishment.
Right.
We're not looking at everyday people, and I feel like it's important to point that out, because a lot of people that I come in contact with, a lot of Baltimore is everyday working class Black people. And I feel like it's good for them to see and know that there were people who didn't really, fuck with politics like that,
right,
but had a political impact.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that is personally something that really played a role in me believing that I could be an organizer. Having that example coming up of my parents being student organizers around the time of this article that's in the 70s and the 60s, and even having the benefit of having gone to the same school as like Lawrence and Davon and Adam and Candace, everybody on the team at LBS. And the way that I would tell the stories, I never really had the benefit of thinking that it wasn't our job to do it. Because they were just my friends. They were just, or people that I knew of, or friends of friends that was really doing work that led to systemic change on campus, that led to education sessions that they were putting on by themselves. So I think you point into how it's really important for everyday people like you and me to have those examples of everyday people doing the work, because the story that mainstream history tells us is that it's these exceptional people. Like that exceptionalism is one of the main drivers of white supremacist narrative of American history. That exceptional people do exceptional things to disconnect everyday people from the change that they can actually make in their own communities. So I think that's a great point that you made.
Yeah. And while we're focusing on Baltimore, I also want to just take more time to highlight some of the national partners and how big CORE was as a national partner. CORE opened their office on the 800 block of North Gay Street after their 1964. They had a 1964 national convention that was a part of an agreement to move into the hood, basically, like to be amongst the people. And so that convention was in 1964. And in 1966, they kicked off that movement by choosing Baltimore as their target city. In the same year, there was this Black Power as the national, basically like the national theme, right? I actually read an article in the Washington Post this morning that was actually talking about the Target City initiative. And it's interesting because they made Black Power synonymous with violence and hurting white people, basically. Hurting and hating white people so much that there was a consideration given of bringing in the National Guard. Now they're talking about bringing in the National Guard, and this is not like there's a riot or a protest or nothing. This is just people saying we're going to organize around Black Power,
right?
And it translating in their ears to, oh, the Black people are about to tear stuff up and kill all the white people, and we're considering bringing in the National Guard just at the possibility. Another big partner is in March 1968, St. Augustine Lutheran Church in Baltimore. They sponsored a talk by King He was touring to raise support around the Poor People's Campaign in DC. And so King came to Baltimore. Now I want to paint this picture for you of when King came to Baltimore, and then you also think about how quickly that same year that he came to Baltimore, he died months later, right? I mean, just putting into context in terms of the space, the location, and the time period. You joined, also sponsored a talk by Stokely Carmichael at Morgan State University. So during that time, Stokely Carmichael came to Morgan State University. So we talk about being in search of Black power and like how were they able to do some of the work that they were able to do. There's a way in which folks showed up where they were very deeply specific to location, to Gilmore Homes or wherever or Donald Homes or wherever their specific location was, but also was able to tap into this national Black power movement, this national movement space. And then you also see there's this collaboration. We're talking about CORE. I mentioned Morgan State University, and then we also have St. Augustine Lutheran Church, right? We're co-creating and collaborating around this common issue and focus. And I feel like that, as we talk about searching for Black power, I see a lot of our power, one, in our unity is what I get from this article. And also power in base building from the ground up.
Right. And base builder, I think something else in the article that speaks really well to base building from the ground up and collaboration across class, across social status. In the article, Rhonda Williams points to a conference that organizers in Baltimore actually put together that brought together people from mainstream institutions like Morgan, and the welfare rights organizers and the Soul Street organizers all together in one to discuss forming a united Black front to address the issues that they realized they were all facing. Dr. Huma Faber, the founder and creator of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University, is quoted in the article as recognizing the importance of not just working in a silo in the academic space to speak power to Black power, but also recognizing the work that the Soul School was doing on the ground, recognizing the work that the welfare rights organizers saw success in. One of the things that I think is important to point out that the welfare rights organizers actually are the cause of is escrow litigation and escrow law in Maryland. Like, it is for Baltimore welfare rights organizers in Maryland are who bring rent escrow to fruition for the state. So that is a benefit that people across the state now have, that at one point in time, stuff like rodent infestation, mold, dilapidated housing condition, none of those things were actually, like, rent escrow didn't exist. So now we have this system that we have these organizers that we're reading about in this article, and that we know existed in our city in the 60s and the 70s. We have them to thank for that legislation that, while it's not perfect, makes a big difference in how renters are able to advocate for themselves against slumlords and landlords in the city and across the state.
Yeah, no, that rent escrow piece is actually really big. There's a couple of different things that I feel like is big in terms of like pulling out certain takeaways and what they were able to accomplish. I mean, one of the things that I get from this is that Black coalition building is powerful, but also in some cases it seems like it's a little bit rarer these days, but it's very powerful. And I feel like it's one of those things that we could do better to like tap into across like like I said, you have Institute of Higher Education, and then you also have this religious institution, and then you also have this local grassroots organization. And I feel like a lot of that had to do with that they were unified under a single, like the goal or the focus was Black power, and everybody was like, okay, this is our plan, this is our marching orders, this is how we do this on a local level, this is how we do it on a citywide level, and then so forth and so on. And I feel like so much of when folks want to organize, they go straight to national, like this national movement. But it's like, okay, how can you get stuff done in your neighborhood? How can you get stuff done on your block? Right? These women started in the very homes that they lived in, and galvanized folks and mobilized folks who were their direct neighbors. Like, how can we get our neighbors to show up and to do stuff? Yeah, so this has been a really good conversation. And for folks who are listening or just tuning in, this episode with myself, Rasheem, and MJ, we've been exploring the legacy and the continued relevance, actually, of Black poor women's activism in Baltimore, focusing on housing, justice, and welfare rights. We've largely been drawing from Rhonda Y. Williams' seminal article, "We're Tired of Being Treated Like Dogs." That's actually the name of the article. We delve into the political lives of Black women who mobilize against institutional neglect and economic exploitation from the 1960s. And later, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the present day movements. A lot of our conversation has centered on the historical and grassroots efforts of Black women like Margaret McCarty and Reverend Annie Chambers, who turned personal struggle into collective resistance. Organizations like UJoin, Union for Jobs or Income Now, or Mother Rescuers from Poverty, which emerged from East Baltimore neighborhoods and housing complexes such as Murphy Homes, O'Donnell Heights, and Gilmore Homes, community marked by poverty, but rich in organizing tradition. We talked a bit about how federal surveillance, welfare fraud, prosecution, and slumlord neglect were met with tenant strikes, welfare marches, legislative advocacy. Leaders at that time challenged both structural racism and class exploitation. I feel like I would like to see more of that in present day movement spaces, because that draws a lot on Black radical tradition that was grassroots based and actually anti-capitalist, right? And unapologetically of the people. We focused on some key locations such as North Gay Street, Pennsylvania Avenue, which serves as landmarks of resistance, while institutions like the Soul School became spaces for political education. We also talked a little bit on the national organizations like CORE and speakers such as Stokely Carmichael, Dr. Martin Luther King, who amplified the local struggle on a national stage. And now what we want to do is kind of talk about, particularly if you are local to Baltimore, some of the folks who are continuing some of this work in defense of a place to live.
Right. So housing organizing is gaining a lot of momentum in Baltimore currently. We see that through organizations like Baltimore Renters United, or BRUH, as they're affectionately known, BRU, that is. And currently, leaders at BRUH, Detrice Downdridge is the ED, and Heather and Elena are organizers who we actively see in community.
Shout out to Heather and Detrice for
right. For sure. That we see them in community doing the work of making sure tenants understand the right that they have to organize and galvanize, just like Mother Rescuers from Poverty did. It's really fun. Found out in our prep for this recording, actually, that Dr. Rasheem made sure that Heather had the article that we are referencing today. And I didn't notice, but literally on a meeting that Heather was at last week, she was quoting the work that Margaret McCarty did, and the importance that people right now have that same energy and tenacity behind taking action against slumlords, right? BRUH does the work of organizing tenants and doing tenant education around the rights that they have to hold their landlords and slumlords accountable to having them live in abysmal housing environments. So again, that's Baltimore Renters United, some people doing the work right now. You can reach out to them at their website, which is BaltimoreRentersUnited.org. They have a phone number where they can help in real time and give you resources for additional help if you are in any need as it relates to tenant rights, impediments or anything like that. They also are not just for renters. So if you are a person with a mortgage, you can also be a part of Baltimore Renters United if you recognize the need for people to speak truth to power for themselves and not be oppressed by slumlords and housing policy that currently does not support the residents of Maryland, but the people who get the rent. Another space that has gained a lot of momentum in the city. Actually, my conversation with Miss Denise pointed out how long this type of work has been happening, actually, but Mayor Kathleen Pugh put in place to address the vacant problem that Maryland has. And Ms. Denise shared with me that actually before Kathleen Pugh was in office, there were over 70,000 vacants in the city now. And they're currently about 25,000 to 30,000. And while that's still a crazy amount, that was not a decrease in vacants that I was actually aware of prior to my conversation with Ms. Denise. And one of the ways that residents of Baltimore are addressing the vacants is through land trust work. So some of the land trust work is a model of collective land stewardship that happens, that takes ownership from the city and puts it in the hands of the people through a way that doesn't make an individual solely liable for land, but the community actually having ownership over land within their neighborhoods. Some orgs that do this work, there's actually a coalition called the Share Coalition. You can find them at sharebaltimore.org, and they're a coalition of land trust organizations throughout the city, of which Miss Janice Jones-Dorsey organization, the Northeast Housing Initiative, which is in Northeast Baltimore, that she's the chair of, is actually a member of. And I just wanted to point out one other organization that is deep in the work of land trusts and addressing the problem addressing the vacant problem in Baltimore, and that's SOS Baltimore, who is a great partner and friend and family member of ours at LBS, led currently by one of the co-founders, Nika Namdi. And you can find more about SOS and the ways that they address the ways that they address and fight for redress for housing harm in Baltimore, through a way that centers decolonizing land ownership and dismantling and disrupting the predatory system of home loans, pretty much. You can find them at thesosfund.com and learn more about the great work that they're doing.
Awesome. So I'm just going to give a general summary of, not a summary, but like a closing out. And then MJ is going to share with folks like how to stay connected with LBS, how to follow, how to be a sustainer, how to be down, how to be fam, all of that. So in closing, one of the things that I hope that folks were able to get from this conversation, as we talk about, searching for Black power, a big thing that I got from reading this article was around the power of coalition building, the necessity of political independence, and the importance of reclaiming radical traditions that center on the voices of poor Black women in the fight for housing, dignity, and justice. So how can people stay connected with, follow, and support LBS, MJ?
Yes, if you like conversations like the one we had today and previous conversations that you heard on In Search of Black Power, you can follow us on all social media. That's TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. Everything is LBS Baltimore, spelled out the right way. LBS Baltimore on all socials. You can follow us and connect with us. You can also find us on our website, lbsbaltimore.com. And another way that you're able to contribute is the base of LBS's power and community is our base, literally. We actually receive monthly contributions for people in community who consider our work valuable and recognize the importance of supporting not only through sharing and showing up to our events, but also financially to be able to sustain our work so we're able to do it unapologetically. in a way that follows the Black radical tradition, calling truth to power and challenging capitalism and pushing back against race class issues. If you are interested in becoming a monthly sustainer, you can sustain as little or as much as you are able to. You can find that at lbsbaltimore.com/invest, or if you go to our website, invest is one of the drop downs in the website menu, and that is where you can sign up to become a sustainer, as well as sign up for our email list, so you are up to date with all of the things that we have going on prior to them happening.
So thank you so much for everyone for listening and for being engaged. And I'm imagining that you're listening to this because you're out here doing this work, or you want to be informed on how to do this work, or you are in search of Black power yourself. So today has been a good experience for us. I'm Dr. Rasheem.
I'm Mary Jalil, MJ for short.
MJ for short. And this has been In Search of Black Power.
Thank y'all. Peace.